Good afternoon, everyone. My name's Gaydon. I work at Accedo, and we are here to talk about redefining the sports experience using some new and some, not so new technologies, specifically augmented reality, virtual reality, voice control, and machine learning. So I've got 20 minutes, and I could probably spend an hour on each of those, so I'll be going through fairly quickly. I think we have a bit of a issue with the display. Let me see if that, can we straighten that up? I'll keep talking while we do that anyway. So for those of you who are not familiar with Accedo, we're a video solutions provider. We have a portfolio of products, services, and managed services, and we support a number of premium media and entertainment and sports companies around the world, some of which you can see on this slide and some of which you can't. So if we talk about sports briefly, I think we recently had obviously the soccer World Cup, I should say, because we're in the States. We supported around about 8 million unique users throughout the World Cup finals on our cloud platform. We did about 9.5 billion API requests, about 95 terabytes of data transferred. And really all that tells you is that we are able to support live events at scale. We work with the likes of Fox Sports, NBC Sports, and companies of that sort of range and profile. I'm going to pause for 2 seconds. Okay, that looks better. So the work that we're doing in sports and in those technologies that I mentioned is primarily driven by our innovations team, who I have the pleasure to work with. We have a reasonably small team, but they're very active. We spend a lot of time on ideation internally. We encourage our teams globally to come up with new concepts, new POCs that we can look at and kind of build out and hopefully take through to our customers via our kind of innovation workshop. So we will work with prospects, with customers on sort of AR concepts, on VR concepts, and we're going to talk about some of these right now. So the first thing I would like to start with, though, is why do we think the sports user experience needs innovation? Why does it need these sorts of different experiences? My answer to that is because sports is almost unique, I think, in terms of the emotion and the passion that it generates in its audience, the fans. I'm married, I have 2 children. If you ask me what the best day of my life was, it was probably when Chelsea won the Champions League. Don't tell my wife that. So what that means is you have an incredibly passionate, incredibly dedicated audience, and that leads them to talk about what they're seeing, to share their experiences. They start creating content. They're on social media feeds, they're blogging, they're recording on GoPro, they're recording on their smartphone. They're creating a wealth of content around the live game itself. So this isn't even the match that's being broadcast, it's not even the archive, it's a wealth of sort of user-generated content, and that really gives us a huge richness and depth of content which lends itself to new and interesting types of user experience. So I want to start looking perhaps at some of the more well-known and kind of prevalent technologies that we've been talking about. So looking at what you can do with artificial intelligence and machine learning when applying it to the archive. So it's interesting, taking a look on YouTube, the amount of time and the number of people who are watching old sports content. So this is, what is that, the 1994 World Cup, so however many years ago that is. People are going onto YouTube and they're watching the whole match. They're not just watching a goal. This is dedication, but it also shows a desire to be able to access that content and consume it. If you think about sports bodies, federations, the clubs, leagues, the Olympics, FIFA, all of these guys, they have these incredibly rich archives of content, hundreds and thousands of hours. There is an audience out there that wants to be able to interact with this content, that wants to be able to consume it, that is passionate about it, that wants to talk about it, that wants to share it. I think for a lot of organizations, that archive represents an unknown quantity in terms of we're not even sure that we know what's there. Forget about whether it's got rich metadata, forget about whether it's encoded into all the right formats you would need to display it on smartphones and tablets. Like, it's this sort of big mass of content, and we don't know what to do with it. Imagine, if you will, being able to take some of the technologies that we have now available, apply those technologies to those thousands of hours of archives, to categorize it, to augment the data, to make it discoverable and searchable and shareable. And all of a sudden, you have an incredible resource with which to engage and delight your audiences. And so we did a piece of work with AWS and their recognition technology recently for a broadcaster, but actually thinking about how you could apply that to an archive of sports content. You can use facial recognition to generate a list of all of the players in the game. You can create timestamps when those players are involved in key moments, whether that's a goal, a tackle, a penalty, a foul. You can use those technologies to really surface all of that content in the way that the user wants to interact with it. So the user is then able to, to search, to discover, to share, and it's creating a really fantastic experience. And the overhead to you, the sports organization, the body, is much less because of this new type of technology. We've already, one of my colleagues, I think, has already spoken in detail about smart speakers and voice-enabled services. But again, if we look at what voice can do for sports, so this is a concept that we developed for TSN Sports in Canada, and we built it around the Google Voice service. So first of all, you get an interface which gives you immediate feedback based on your voice input. So a number of different types of interaction, whether that's looking for stats, whether that's looking for a different channel, whether that's looking for league standings, and you can interact again with the content through voice. Do I want to watch Croatia versus France? Do I want to watch Maple Leaf versus Bruins? It's possible to switch between live, on demand. It's possible to overlay statistics, and all of this through that voice interface, which is very natural, very straightforward. The stats for voice penetration, I think, as we know, are incredible. I was quite astonished to learn that I think it's the X1 platform gets something like 73 million voice searches a month, which is a pretty big number. So again, we think that when you're looking at sports, when you're looking at the depth of content that is available, whether it is user-generated content, whether it's archive content, whether it's statistics, standings, these are all great examples of content that can be brought together and really provide a delightful user experience for your audience using voice control. If we then kind of look at how you might link the archive concept that we were talking about, and that ability to use machine learning, to use AI to really go deep into that archive, to generate that metadata, to categorize it. So it gives you some interesting possibilities to then use voice to say, okay, I'm in a service, Google, show me the best goals of, in this case, Iniesta, who plays for Barcelona, but you could equally say LeBron James, who plays for the, anyone? Cavaliers still? Anyway, and so on and so on. And so, again, the ability for the user to interact with that content, to create a very personalized experience, a very individual experience, which I think as a fan, it would delight me. Let's move on and look at some of the experiences that we've been working on around augmented reality. I think the first thing to sort of do is to maybe take a step back and say, where do we at Accedo think that television is going? So ultimately, we think that it's going to move to this kind of concept of holographic television, where every screen or every surface can be used, if you will, as a television, an old school television, but there's a kind of three-dimensional aspect to it that really is a little bit like that game of chess in the first episode of Star Wars. And so Where augmented television or augmented reality television sits at the moment is it's complementing a regular broadcast with an additional experience or set of experiences that we're able to portray onto kind of living room objects like a table, like a wall, etc. Now, the big thing with augmented reality, and obviously also virtual reality, is that you need a wearable device in order to interact with these experiences. I imagine that many of us here have tried those wearable devices. My experience is that they're fantastic and exciting. They're also quite uncomfortable. They can be quite clunky. The earlier ones made you nauseous, which is obviously not a delightful user experience. So, the point at which certainly AR becomes more accessible and more mainstream is going to largely depend on the evolution of the wearables. So Magic Leap, we think, is a company who's probably furthest down the line in terms of coming up with a wearable concept that's actually comfortable and looks kind of cool. But obviously, when Ray-Ban invent wearable glasses that actually look like Ray-Bans, that's when everybody's going to go out and buy them. So there is there's an evolution that needs to happen there, I think, before AR becomes mass market. However, it is interesting to note that the likes of Apple and Google are seeing that is coming, because they're building the capability to develop augmented reality experiences into their existing frameworks for their devices. So you can build AR experiences into iPhone applications, into Android applications right now. So they see it coming, and they're kind of giving us the tool set now to start to create these experiences in anticipation of when they really hit the mainstream. So if we think about what you can do with augmented reality around sports, there are a huge number of possibilities. So we could look at interactive player positions, we can look at different data layers, we can look at different camera screens. There are some really interesting opportunities, we think, around merchandising, which obviously from a revenue perspective is great. Some great things around social augmented reality, which we'll look at in a minute. So really you're kind of presented with a wide portfolio of choices for how you overlay augmented reality into your sports experience. So these are some examples that we worked on recently with a customer of ours. So what you have to imagine here is that you're wearing your glasses and you're projecting this hologram onto your living room table here, and what you're seeing is the team that is being put out, the football team that's being put out for this particular match, all of them in their positions, named, etc., and the ability to kind of focus in on one of them and overlay that with player-specific statistics. How many passes, how far have they run, how many red cards did they receive. We did some user testing with some focus groups recently, and a lot of them said that they would, for instance, like to be able to order pizza when they're watching a game. And would it be possible to integrate that into an experience so that they could just touch or reach or click, and it would dial Pizza Hut and your pizza would arrive? There are also some interesting opportunities around sort of creating virtual studios. So here you have the coach who's being interviewed, maybe it's pre-game, maybe it's post-game, and again here you have his image, his 3D sort of holographic image, sitting in your kitchen, and it's like a personal conversation. It's like he's there with you. So these are some really interesting opportunities. You can see on the wall there, we've projected sponsor logos. So again, the opportunities, I think, both for the fan, for the service provider, for the sponsors, there's a richness there that we think is very interesting and that we think is worth mining. Again, we talked about social augmented reality. So we all know how much people like to use their smartphones. These filters are very, very simple to create. When we go and talk to a sports organization, we go and talk to anybody about sports, we usually create some AR filters for each of those meetings. It is not complicated if you know what you're doing. And again, it's just a really nice way of sort of showing the interactivity that's available, the personalization that's available, and the fun that's available. And sports ultimately should be about fun. So we've done some things on Snapchat, Instagram, Facebook. This was in support of the recent Soccer World Cup. And again, very, very straightforward, but it really gives that additional experience, that kind of depth to the fans, which again is great for them. This is one of our earlier augmented reality prototypes, which I think again we're using the iPad Plus here. So this is a cycle race, and I can't name it, I think, because it's problematic. But what you can see here is they're going through obviously the road, the camera, the main camera angle on the big screen. But what you're seeing on the iPad Plus here, which I think for racing sports works really well, is you're getting context to that race that you don't really get from that main broadcast feed, which is, let's say, from the leader's perspective, or maybe it's from the main group's perspective. So they're kind of looking ahead, you can see the road ahead. Okay, so how much further has the race got to go? What is the gradient of the hills? Where are the different groups of riders in the context of that race? And again, it just gives you a sort of a richness of the experience. It gives you more context, and I think it brings, certainly for me, I've never been a cycling fan per se, but I looked at this and it made me more interested in that sport. So you can imagine using that for motor racing, horse racing, any type of racing. So again, we think this is just a really, really nice, again, pretty simple way of bringing an enhanced and augmented experience into sports. So I've saved the sort of, probably the one, if you like, that's kind of furthest out from being the mainstream, we think, until last. So virtual reality. I think virtual reality has had a few sort of false dawns, if you will. There's also an interesting question about, okay, when does AR and VR kind of collapse and become the same thing? I suppose, as I think of it, the main difference between the two of them is that when you're in a virtual reality experience, you're effectively cut off. You're creating a completely new environment, hence the goggles are all blacked out, versus interacting with the environment in which you're sitting. And so that creates a different wealth of possibilities in terms of user engagement, in terms of what you can do, but it's also, I think the miniaturization piece is going to be a lot more complicated. We've built some really, I think, interesting and exciting VR experiences, all the way from using the kind of cardboard goggles to the latest Oculus devices, which are fantastic. What I wanted to sort of just finish with is this is something that we built for the National Basketball League in Australia. And of course, the idea is to replicate that experience of being in a stadium. So this is where I think VR is very interesting. So you can be sitting at home on your living room, you put the goggles on and you feel like you're in the stadium. So you've got that sort of 3D, 360 panoramic view. You've got the ability to, again, navigate through the different data sources. So these might be social media feeds, these might be statistics, it might be clips and highlights of the game. And again, there's a sort of, I think, an ability to enrich the experience and also get that, kind of get that live feeling, but not live as in broadcast, live as in you're in the stadium, but with an additional layer of data, an additional layer of content that we think is really interesting and is increasingly how fans want to interact with sports. They want the live game, they want the live match, but equally they want to be able to interact with all of the different data sources, whether that's Twitter, whether that's Facebook, whether that's a blog post, whatever it is, at the same time. I think that's it. If anybody has any questions, I'll be hanging around there for about 5 minutes. Alternatively, our booth is number 9514. Sorry. Thank you very much.